thanks for attending this Seachtain na Gaeilge tour. The original school here was founded in 1908 up in Cullenswood House. It lasted for about 2 years, and it moved here in 1910. It was a school for boys. There was a women's school, Scoil Íde, or for girls, sorry, that survived a few years up in Cullenswood as well. That stayed there when the boys' school moved down to here. And it was founded by Pearse, obviously, and also there was schools founded around that time by the likes of Mary and Etna McSweeney, and Cork as well, Scoil Íde. Not to be confused with Scoil Íde, is the girls' school that was here. That's actually off McSweeney Street in Cork. You can stay in it. It's called Sheila's Hostel now, actually. That survived to the 40s or so. And there was a school then founded by Louise Gavin Duffy in 1917 around in Stephen's Green, and then it transferred down to Cullenswood House after this school closed when Pearse was executed, really. So there was a clutch of schools around here, I suppose, around the turn of the 20th century. And there was also the revival movement was found in Coláistí Saoire. It's just a Gaeilge, so we Scoilní atop chun céin sna hátaí a bhí an láda ó héad na Gaeilge go fáil. Ceantar nach maith saoilú le Gaeltacht san látá nuan, so my house be count in O'Mead. O'Mead in North Louth had a Coláistí Saoire, and there was ones in Donegal as well, and some of them are still around, or they are still used as Coláistí Saoire. So really they were part of an educational and revivalist sort of movement that was coming to the fore around the 20th century, which is now about. But I suppose the main elements of it were, or the príomh element, the príomh gnéithe go féin bheas, féin bhuinín agus féin tilmí I guess. So my young process Scoil Éanna are in a Yugas few an tongue agus an culture agus na Gaeilge Britain. There was a pushback against that sort of degradation against the colonialism as it had engendered, and some of you were at Pádraig's talk in Athlone probably during the week. You would have traced those acts that were brought in over time and the various sort of moves that the British state made to degrade the language and to degrade the Gaels. So what this was about was pushing back against that with sort of 3 key tenets that you see across all decolonial movements, really. Self-respect, self-reliance, and sort of self-belief, and you see these across sort of globally, and I'll talk about that later a bit more. Éirígí na tús na Gaeilge de Stóca Cúis sin ar as go bhí na Protestúni ó Hui le héadí Thomas Russell ach go hála in Hermitage. So bhí an publicánachas an lárnach Glúiseacht na díchálín na Gaeilge an tús. Thomas Russell, the United Irishman, was at the forefront of the decolonial Irish language movement from the very start. So he published, along with a scholar from County Down called Patrick Lynch, a teacher and Gaelic scholar, Ulligan Tulla, which was the first Irish language magazine at the end of the 18th century. So it's no coincidence that Thomas Russell, one of the sort of the foremost radicals in terms of social programs, or thinking socially in terms of what capitalism was doing in the mills and the sort of social program of the United Irishman, he was ahead of most. It's no coincidence that he was also progressive, very progressive on decolonialism and the Irish language as well. Ach in Éirígí Stóchas na Hermitage hosnig an sois Glúiseacht a bheochana a nasc nó a chuthí an chun na Gaeilge agus an Pearse ar bheol agus na Hermitage lár update doherty in our era leis an nuacht an the nation a spraig an glúiseacht Scoil Éanna and so he's náisiúnachas cultúra he's má na aonú. So bhí le héirí William Smith O'Brien dar ná hí session gomach an cín hí Thomas Davies, Thomas Davis, he was to the far. So the young Irelanders really were the ones who developed what Russell had started into a more coherent ideology, I suppose, around cultural nationalism and decolonisation. They didn't call it decolonisation at the time, of course, but in effect that's what it was. But there, it's important to note their class, I suppose, well, their middle class and their upper class. There's that story about, I think, William Smith O'Brien during the 1848 Rising. He was afraid to sort of strategically cut down landlords' trees to, assist in blocking the conservatory and so forth. So, from Acmatábhachtach is kind of the class is important in terms of the Irish language, especially when, I suppose, a lot of it originates in education and so forth, and there's always that tension then between how do you reach the working class with Irish, I suppose, when it's so rooted in its origins through sort of these middle class lines and through education. Is tóca Thomas Davies bhí session a swin of policy dá hangach dus na counter Gaeilge new Gaeilge down again now dus na counter gets larger Gaeilge again now. Thomas Davies he had a bilingual policy. Well, he never fleshed it out, but he wrote it in the paper The Nation, and that was actually put into practice by Cumann na Gaeilge, well, by the British state through campaigning by Cumann na Gaeilge 60 years later in 1905. So you can see the direct sort of lineage there, I suppose. So I mean, hastig goig mek ólas ag na múntóirí sna counter is larger Gaeilge to Hermitage. Davis, he wanted the teachers who were in the national school system, of course the national school system Pearse called the murder machine later. So it was understood by cultural nationalists and those who were decolonising at the time or engaging in that type of work that the national school system was essentially choking the language. So he wrote in The Nation, simply requiring the teachers of national schools in these Irish speaking districts to know Irish and supplying them with Irish translations of the school books would guard the language where it now exists and prevent it being swept away. It dermi an phobal tánicas agus an cé glúiseacht eile tháinig aníg an tháinig óga sé sin na fíní ní raibh policies siléir acu an Gaeilge stóca. Cé go raibh le héirí John Devoy, Patrick Ford, a scrí nuacht an America, the Irish World, Donovan Russell, Daoine mar bhí siad an mór ag son na Gaeilge dar nó ach. On policy bhí acu is go bhféadfadh an Gaeilge fannacht agus sin tugadh an Gaeilge faoi lá tréis an nás splachas. So the Fenians were the next sort of Republican movement, obviously, to follow the Young Irelanders, and they had a great deal of sympathy and a great deal of time for the Irish language. In some of their newspapers, they set aside columns for Irish and so forth. Patrick Ford, the Irish World, which published in America, and Devoy's Gaelic American, and Donovan Russell himself, a native Irish speaker from Skibbereen area, he was very, very pro-Irish language, but there was never a sort of policy around decolonising in the here and now. So what we would say is that they sort of adopted a Gaeilge must wait policy, so similar, to Labour must wait, that was adopted later, and we saw sort of effects of that in the Civil War period and into the foundation of the Free State, where things were put on the long finger. Instead of integrating the process of decolonisation and republicanism and the military aspect as well into one, things were put aside, and that's sort of, as much as I love the Fenians, that's one of their flaws, I would say going forward. Is tóca bhí sé fáca mar se ag Éirígí Éanna, Dini Éanna, and also Philip Barron, he's a Bartlarga of one his school. In update Trucke Cláiste, Gaeilge agus Lehéidi Richard Dalton, it Uberdarn, her Irishamach agus a bhí ar son. So he's craved a one who heart footfall material, one who's Mulde Conan Gaeilge Hánig Bellery. So really it was left to push this decolonial ideology was left to individuals around the middle of the century. So Philip Barron, a man from Waterford, he founded a school called this is Colossus Gaeilge, one Machan, as a Sunday in update in 1835, and he published books and textbooks and so forth on the language. And then it's funny, there's a connection there with the Gael school that's around Portlaoga, Waterford, in that neck of the woods still. It's named after him. So you see that in the Gael school that are founded in the 20th century, they draw directly on, people going back as far as Raftery and even back in Donegal, Rua, so the Gaelic chieftains, there's that direct sort of continuity there in the thinking. Well, I'll come to the Gael school of the 20th century later. And another fella who advanced this ideology when many other people weren't doing was Richard Dalton. He already founded an Fear Éanna, a newspaper in 1862, because he saw the sort of the erosion that was happening. He was in Tipperary in 1862, just after the famine. If you imagine the maps, the Midlands there would have been at the sort of the frontier of where Irish was being pushed back, and he saw this and he wanted to found branches and committees like came after when the revival was in full swing, but he envisaged that, but there wasn't any uptake on it because of the social conditions at the time. The country was just coming out of famine and mass emigration was in full flow. And Puinte Dern of the Stoke Stephen shows the final point I make in here in the entrance hall about this ideology generally is Stoke. Now, it was mixed with nationalism and Akahar snook like shocked out effect to in Luchtarn, Nation, the Irishman, agus Keen Ella Martian, Young Ireland, agus Martian, a core on ideology from Keen. So the Irishman and other nationalist newspapers is where the sort of ideology survived in the 1870s really, and even though there wasn't people walking on the ground on it, most of the nationalist activity was based around the Parliament and the Parliament in Westminster and so forth. But the Irishman wrote in 1876, "Posterity must surely say that no conqueror could kill the nation's honour tongue except helped by the apathy or slavishness of those who are content to let it die out." So I'm playing in a Yishen, one year on SPIL, the Society for the Prevention of it's a Society of the Preservation of the Irish Language. So another hall na go raibh unidiac níos leithne sa agric sin ná mar a bhí Reeves na hagriachtí rivishe a Dave hí sagart hí fear gná agus mar sin de gná bhaoine Stoke well polatóirí comá ach rivishe sin is ruad arslucht when leis an Gaeilge. So the Society SPIL was founded the year after that article was written, and it's the first sort of organisation that brings in broad representation of people. Before that, a lot of the efforts were by individual efforts, as I mentioned, but they were really looking at Irish as an antiquitarian thing and not as something that was living. So it was an upper class sort of academic and antiquitarian pursuit, and then in 1876 it becomes something, right, we want to give this back to the public, to the people, and restore it essentially. So, Trí Bliain a Dhiaidh, I'm going to an SPIL 3 years after the SPIL was founded. Pearse is born, and then a couple of years after that Willie Pearse was born. So Rocket was shot Seomra Willie Pearse. Show
Seomra
Willie Pearse and show my relationship. This is Willie Pearse's room. The father of the Pearses, whose name escaped me, was a sculptor by trade from England, an immigrant, so I was noting that for the far right, and they tried to draw on Pearse's down in England. So yeah, you can read about Willie Pearse on the panels and so forth, but yeah, he was a sculptor, and I think it said that he didn't have such a great output in terms of his art because of his dedication to the language, because when Pearse moved here from Cullenswood House in 1910, and then Pearse became more prominent politically, Willie Pearse took up a lot of the slack in terms of running the school, and he taught art and drama here as well, so these are some of his outputs. But as I mentioned, yeah, they were born the late 1870s and early 1880s, and so both of them would have been coming into their teens when Douglas de Hida wrote the sort of foundational text, maybe you could say, of what Irish language decolonial thought is, the necessity of the anglicising Ireland, so the anglicisation, decolonisation, they mean the same thing really. So yeah, the Umberto would top the shots in the day, mar Louis may nor a scree, nor a hug Douglas de Hida ahiask nu árad voi done coming náisiúnta in literature in uptake now cadal the necessity of the anglicising Ireland. Dar leis paradox of the own go raibh fua ag na hairní gachrúd Sassanach ach ag an own céine ag an nearna siad achris gachrúd Sassanach. So, you know, Hyde's main sort of thesis in that oration that he gave to the National Literary Society in 1892 was it was a paradox. It was strange, it baffled him that Irish people sort of pretended or said they hated everything English, but then at the same time ate them in their culture and in their language. You know, so he said in order to de-anglicise ourselves, we must at once arrest the decay of the Irish language. Agus ag an own céine is tóg a cháin sé na náisiúnaí a hagan méid dá níos luúthe I Westminster, mar go raibh siad an site a grílár an himplachta agus ní raibh spéisiach ús atanga, so bhí an umach a spéisiach I rudí beaga blúríní a aimsiú ó Rialtas Hasna. So in that oration he goes in very hard and challenges the nationalists of the IPP, essentially of the Irish Parliamentary Party, who took no heed of these tenets of self-reliance, especially in terms of culture in Ireland, and were too sort of busy looking for crumbs from the table of Westminster and so forth, looking to, you know, political machinations in London rather than trying to build up a Gaelic culture in Ireland in the face of what was happening, which was a drastic decline of the language and culture. So, Chinnun Kinal Quinta the Egg the Hida Stoka. Like say Bun Club na have you open it agus fialsún of them Scoil Éanna agus in the sin dar now in blin dar gion. So an uptake now the dog sé an árad agus an blin dar gion an uptake now the tree buniu kunna na Gaeilge. Agus stoka bhí sé mar oin siléir ag an cunra an céadú riomh, so he's an beagas fiú an aspa féin basa sin a bhí I mascalá mínta na hairna sin a ruúige agus an féin mas a chuú a rís a mas na daoine. So the year after the oration the Hyde gave Conn na Gaeilge was formed, and it was the first openly decolonial organisation, because it had as its aim to sort of banish the degraded mentality, if you will, and the sort of the lack of self-respect that had been inculcated in Irish people over a process of hundreds of years. They wanted to begin a process where that would unravel, or to turn that back, I suppose. So the corner where the foundation was huge. En is tá sé spéisiúil gan áí an rud a déir a bhrenathairí faoin bunas a látá nu an. Déir si gur sois tradiisiúnathe bhí brathnú siar seachas a brathnú chun céin bhí sa cumra agus gur cinál zílatí nó daoine bhí antiscoch agus mar sin de. Ach an oiríre haspaí gá chun an bheith an glúiseacht na tanga agus an air mar go trí chéile chuir an iúint don sin a raibh siad, so bhí siad nuaimseartha ach bhain siad na cuidaní is fearr an tradiisiún chumach chun an nuaimseartha sin a chur chun céin. So a lot of the revisionists sort of who wrote in the 1970s and to the 90s, I suppose, they would have castigated the Cumra as backward-looking traditionalists and zealots or sort of reactionaries, you know. But this they did because they said they saw that the Cumra, obviously, you know, in some sense harked back to a Gaelic culture, but really they have the reading of that wrong. What the Cumra did and the revival in general was to take sort of the best bits of Gaelic culture and adapt it and put it into use for the modernisation process in which they lived. So they weren't talking about going back in time, they were talking about decolonising contemporaneously, if you like, and using that, and they were always looking to the future. How could you use the best elements of the past to mould and reimagine a new future for Ireland, you know? So the revisionists are, as per usual, wrong. So there's an interesting book there by PJ Matthews called Revival, where he charts how the Cumra linked up with other progressive movements at the time, like the cooperative movement and Sinn Féin, obviously, and also the Abbey Tír. Agus bhí siad sásta freisin glata le beag criticáireach nó cána ó lehéadí ó Choníla agus Sean O'Casey chomá. They were happy to take on board some criticism from socialists from the left as well, from the likes of O'Casey and O'Connell or Connolly, who, you know, Connolly's saying you can't teach a starving man Gaelic, you know, so that's true, and some of the Cumra weren't really thinking about that because of the middle class origins that I mentioned earlier, but they were happy to take that on board and you know, adapt to it. And then they started to develop economic thought around self-sufficiency and Buy Irish campaigns and, you know, founding industries in the country and so forth, although they never moved fully towards communist socialism, obviously, but they were by and large receptive to his criticism and so, you know, broadly progressive. So, yeah, Sinead, so we're going to start there. We move up to the study. Fekishu, Fekishu Foilsik on the show, and Clive Sullish, our Mowers. Ní me go home an kente mar book session book Pearse an show in Éirígí de ach doir sé as a bheith mar agahar an Clive Sullish in Éirígí de come so Pearse was editor of Clive Sullish up to 1910, but also this was when he moved here, so I don't know, the tour guide will probably be able to tell you whether it's accurate or not, if that's on the page. But River sin bhí ag an Cumra bhí Éirígí Rim Clive Sullish bin an fáin an le agus is fáca má tá min leanach do roi ón árad book de níd agus mar sin de faoi deir na híise up ag ná 8 nó mar sin bhí dá trí craves is here agus Seachtain America agus an tarachtas bunathe agus fáin an le ag an Cumra, so bhí si treis méadú go mór agus sin dumpig fáin an le an nuacht an isteach sa Clive Sullish in up ag nácanna agus so go chóir sé an bhí siad an an faoin trá sin a chuid feall soon up the Cork and Clean go má go héifeachta. So yeah, the precursor to Clive Sullish was Fáine and Lay, the newspaper, and by moving on from when the early years when the Cullin were founded after the heat of speech. By the turn of the 20th century, sort of 1898, 1900, they're quite strong. They're able to sort of project the colonial ideology effectively. They have about 43 branches, seven of them in America, and then the Fáinne and Lay turns in, was relaunched, I suppose, as employed Sullish in 1899. Sorry. So Ranelagh win an chun amach ag tús na híise, faoi tús na híise ná I dtí na scoilne, líon na scoilne a bhí an Gaeilge mar ábhar acu. So dáirí sé sin ó 150 in 1899 go 1983 faoi 1904. So sin leint suntasach an sin dul an cían an mór. Agus dóir lá policy dá handach sin Louis Mary's Luga Cordovoy in 1902. So one of the other great advances the Corner made by the turn of the 20th century was that they managed to increase the number of schools that taught through Irish as a subject, not through Irish, but Irish as a subject, from 105 in 1899 to nearly 2000 basically in 1904. So that was substantial, and the bilingual policy that I mentioned earlier as well, they managed to implement that in the still strong Irish speaking areas in the West in 1905. And the ironic thing about that policy, I suppose, was that that was a bilingual policy that the British state put into place. And then in 1922, when quasi-independence was gained for 26 counties, that policy was done away with. And it was actually more effective at, I suppose, in terms of the Gaeilge community, it was more effective because some of the Gaeilge parents wanted English, but also it could have been rolled out across the state. But what was brought in was a sort of a monolingual Irish language policy that was built on sand, and it wasn't child focused, so it was more about pushing the ideology of the state. And then that's why there was this backlash against it, really, because it was more about moulding children to the state's will instead of sort of meeting the children where they were at and doing things from the bottom up. So that started to change in the 60s when, you know, pedagogy became more of a thing in teaching, and when different social factors sort of aligned to change that mindset. And then the Gaeilge school movement went with that and realised, right, we can nurture Gaeilge in children from, you know, on Cleve onward, from their youth, but we don't sort of push it on for state ideological reasons, I suppose. And of course Catholicism and corporal punishment was mixed in with that as well. Rud eile dóir leis an Scoil Éanna faoi hús feithúis rud mór ná dóir lá Éirígí na Hibreacha titan líon na Gaeilge ísliú agus is tóga, you know, not only had they achieved those things with certain policies in terms of education, but they had arrested the decline of the native speakers, or speakers somewhat, not native speakers, because more people started declaring that they could speak Irish. For example, I was just looking, I happened to wander in on my mum on the computer the other day, and she was looking at relatives on her mother's side in Donegal, Boyles, and at the census in 1901 and 1911. So in 1901 they listed English, and only the dad apparently had spoke Irish and English. But by 1911 they had all listed Irish and English. So there was a sort of a change in mentality there, that the revival had allowed these people to start putting on the census, right, we do have Irish, instead of being ashamed of it, you know what I mean? So yeah, stócha bhí carta simbalacha eile buinte amach, bhí seoltaí poist agus cóthaíocht agus rudí mar sin, cóthaíocht dá hanga bhí cead daoine I sinna úsáid comach, agus stócha hiag Pearse nach féifi an tarna a háú le stiad an improcht, agus sinna fábhar bhuaine sé Scoil Éanna in 1908, agus bóg sin an seo in 1909 mar a dean. Ach the war sin agus the war rudi eile bí táil go fulla tú husna sé boga I drá seasamh a bhád ní radici. So Pearse, even with these sort of advances that have been made, and with other advances such as the Cumhra campaign that allowed addresses to be used in Irish and signage on shops and things like that. There's an interesting documentary in Truckling Down that documents the struggle of Pearse and a fellow called Gaeilge in Donegal with the state that allowed this Irish language signage on his car. But so they'd achieve things like that in terms of visibility. But Pearse, probably in this room, in 1910 onwards, would have started thinking about, well, you're not really going to you're not going to push back the decline, arrest the decline within the imperial context, and then obviously with different political factors that were going on at the time, the foundation of the Ulster Volunteers, the North began, and 1913, the Irish Volunteers, Pearse starts moving in a much more radical position, and he joins the IRB in 1913. Well, I think that sort of understanding that you can't, there's only so much you can do with the British state and with the language, moves them in that direction as well. Agus ag ardeis chun na bheig a néad ag chuig the war an glúis an bailach sin a bhí siad a dul bhí scoilt down go bhunúsach agus scoilt na daoine radicacha a bhí san IRB le so is daoine ní cumádach ach daoine ná has to bheith go meid an politics is just a chun an náisiúnachas go bhunúsach. So that move by Pearse and others within the Cumhra in 1915 leads to a split at the Ardèche where Douglas de Hide, he leaves because he doesn't want nationalism or the IRB essentially to control the movement. But he in Corkin Boss, Pearse, Rialtas na Bratna, Keiko, Lorna is a being Cumhra, it's an Irish mock really. So after Pearse's execution, and the fact that 5 of the 7 signatories were members of Cumhra na Gaeilge, the proclamation, the British government understood how central the revival of Cumhra na Gaeilge was to the whole rising, because they banned it as a grave menace, or the Lord Lieutenant did in 1917. So Cumhra na Gaeilge was banned from then on out. So this is where he would have done a lot of his meditation, I suppose, on the language question and on its relationship to imperialism and the future potential of it within the imperialist context, and he concluded that a rising was necessary. And that's one of the main times the Cumhra is moving with the people. And actually, Andrea O'Cahissy, who wrote a book on that Ardèche itself, which is quite interesting, he said that the Cumhra had their finger on the pulse of where the change in mentality was going before even 1916. So a lot of the histories you'll read are sort of, people had this eureka-like moment after the leaders were executed, but actually the society was moving in that sort of republican or separatist direction anyway prior to that, and you could see that in the Cumhra where people started backing separatism and a break from the old enemy, of course. Yeah. So Sinead on style, so we're going to be in Seanna City. Seanna City sitting room. So an rud atá suntas up in Seanna City stocha ná goes Seanna City is school agus go hastig why an Pearse so he's normal dhéanamh an school gur áit cónathach a bhí ann cónathe a bhí ann chomá seachas tíreach school. So yeah, the sitting room, I suppose, one of the main points about it is that he wanted to sort of make the school as homely as possible, and this he done in opposition to everything that had gone before in terms of the education system from 1831, which he called, as I mentioned earlier, the murder machine, and where it was just sort of graphs and figures on a wall and a teacher administering corporal punishment until the child had absorb these figures into their brain, so he set out to make it more homely, and he did that with the sort of ideology of fosterage, which was a Gaeilge thing going back to the Fianna really and so forth. So he railed against the murder machine, and I suppose be critic den capitalists in Malach, maar daar nou we like kind of roach area, daar nou we like she's on chorus Scoil Íde in air and con on capitalists because in Scoil Éanna is a horse up. So the murder machine could be viewed as a critique of capitalist schooling, because it was all the school system was built to change citizens' Irish subjects into sort of English subjects within the capitalist context, and then create workers for the, well, there was no industrialisation, but create workers anyway. So on Rud a Viega, on kind of Fjellsunach de Viega na Fjellsunach Idicus or Forlas of Radical, and that's forgotten about him sometimes, is that he was a radical educationist and progressive on that question. And as I mentioned, it was founded on the child, nurturing the child rather than sort of bending the child to the will of the system that existed at the time. And then he said, he talked about mere machinery, or he said we can all foresee that the first task of a free Ireland must be destructive, that the lusty strokes of Gaeilge and Gaul Ulster taking its mantle apart will hew away and cast adrift the rotten and worm-eaten boards which support the grotesque fabric of the English education system. So that's a sort of Republican call between Gaeilge and Gaul and people in Ulster as well, a Republican call to do away with the imperialist schooling system that existed at the time. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a sort of the irony was that there was another murder machine then imposed post 1922, but it was Catholic and nominally Irish speaking, even though it wasn't really. It was mostly symbolic, that they weren't nurturing the child the way Pearse had with bilingual education and developing all their sort of talents, or bringing out the best talents in them. So Maradoras hánig forward the ideology the Keens and Éirígí Shaskady and Akahara rinne a dumpy sheer on murder machine according with a volume on Éirígí Fehadal. So his idea of fosterage was the words that the old Irish employed when they spoke of education show that they gripped the very heart of the problem. To the old Irish, the teacher was Acha, foster, the pupil was Dalta, foster child, the system was Aficus, fosterage, words which we still retain as Ide, Dalta, and Idachus, educate our student and education. So that's his philosophy, and that's what I suppose having a sitting room in a school is about, and the different various ways that he made the school feel homely with statues and art and plants instead of just graphs that beat in facts into the child and make them sort of compliant imperial drones, I suppose. One Shamra Lapa stoke in a dormitory. So Maradoras hánig deire leis an aviopen, so he's in Éirígí Fehadal. Agus cuaig daoine a roi, or bhí daoine bhí an múna an seo chuaigh siad a roi chun páirte a gachas a stát nua. So ceann díobh ná Pádraig Ógáil Chunra. So the dormitory, I mean, many sort of prominent figures who went on to administer the Free State as well, but also who were, some of them were in opposition to the Free State, would have been in here. But I suppose one of the great failures, I suppose, of the revival movement was, or a mistake, was that after 1922 they believed the work was done, that they could rely on the state. And one of the people who was in here was Pádraig Ógáil Chunra, son of Pádraig Ógáil Chunra, and he's an interesting character. he died in 1923, I think. But he, again, Andrew Sarkozy has an interesting book on him, on his life, and he was an Irish speaker from Lusmuck and revolutionary in his outlook. He was greatly influenced by the Russian Revolution and so forth. Mar derim stocha cégar glachan séastáil le clár cultúrtha an chunra sna fehadí strucadí, ní raibh siad sásta an mhuinú a chur ar leatíomh chun chur a bhfuil. So one of the main issues was that although the state actually did adopt Conradh Gaeilge and what was essentially Pearse's cultural programme in the 1920s, they weren't satisfied, or they weren't happy to put the funding in place for it. So, and that might have come back where this question of how politics and economics and culture or cultural mindset interact, and might come back to say the fact that in 1922 only a tiny percentage of new civil servants were brought in when the Free State was founded. They were mostly still reliant on British administrators, the counter-revolutionaries, Ernest Blythe, and that he basically took Westminster's fiscal programme as a blueprint and so forth. So I mean, although there was symbolic nods to Irishness, I mean, had they really decolonised in terms of economics and politics and so forth? And then obviously one of the funnier ones, I suppose, is Cosgrave went around wearing top hats, William Cosgrave, to try and ape the British aristocracy, even though he would have nominally said he supported Conradh Gaeilge, but there was a lot of sort of Shawnee in there in the mix as well, even in the Republican movement at the time. But I suppose one of the things that it did at the time, and as Matthew says in his book is interesting, the revival sort of brought about the emergence, he says, of a loose cadre of intellectuals who subscribed to a broad civic nationalism and who drew in turn on ideas of cooperation, republicanism, socialism and anti-imperialism. So that persists, even though you have this flight of the Earls after, well, not flight of the Earls, flight of the geese again, after 1923, where a lot of the most radical people go to America because they're banished through blacklisting and through other means from the Free State. You do still have these loose networks of people who continue to push the progressive elements of the Irish language. And in 1934 then you have Undertook, which is a newspaper that's founded in the Gaeilge in Connemara. It's a socialist Irish language newspaper. It was distributed to about 500 people. Rud tábhacht le eile dar nó ag an ann céine bhí le Martin O'Coin atá an céine agus bhí sesin a tarrant ideolacht and fiercey. So Martin O'Coin comes to the fore around that time, him a Republican of course, an Irish speaker, a writer, prominent writer from Scoil, and he, through a campaign of Conradh Gaeilge, manages to found the Rathfarnham Gaeilge, which is still there. He founds that in 1935, and him and his comrades, mainly Sean and Cullenswood, very influenced by Pearse and by Connolly, of course, because what they wanted was not just Pearse's Gaelic and Free Ireland, they wanted Connolly's Gaelic, a workers' republic, so they combined both Pearse and Connolly. So sna Gaeilge and sin, bhí really saw ciún ar fad tamil mar eolgur ceap look na Gaeilge agus look an dícholína go raibh go dhéanamh chud start an bart ach in Éirígí bhí really dul leig, so there was a sort of inertia there between bar efforts by O'Coin and that generally the Irish language movement was in a period of inertia in the middle of the 20th century. Because they relied too much on the state or what Dev was doing, or what was promised and not delivered and so forth. But the problem was they wouldn't address the material problems in the Gaeilge, and therefore the language kept eroding. Oxnade Gaeilge Honig, so it's Bullet Arish. By the 1950s, Irish speakers realised that the state wasn't going to fulfil what revivalists like Pearse and so forth who wanted, and they started to found movements like Gaeilge, which is about self-sufficiency really. Gaeilge was really, there was a lot of bingo and fundraising and things like that by Gaeilge, but it was really about funding the Irish language in a self-sufficient way by drawing on pools of support to do that. And then in Feiriste, Calmots, Gaeilge, in Belfast, you have the founder of Cullenswood. Well, they knew they weren't going to get anything from the state, I suppose, but yeah, that was an important seed for them, I suppose. From Cullenswood, you get the Bogus Shoy, the urban Gaeltacht later, and then the schools, and then all the schools after that in the 6 counties, really. And around the same time, Scoil Íde, which is down around Pearse, down not far to the east of here, is founded, and then Scoil Éanna after that. So really, after that period of inertia, it dawns on Irish speakers slowly that the state isn't going to sort of do anything for them when they start to found the Gaeilge school movement. Agus tógtha an oibe bhí ann ná go raibh institiúidú déanta Gaeilge na Gaeilge. There was an institutionalisation done of the language where, places were offered to language, prominent language, Irish language speakers in the civil service, in the state and so forth, and that's sort of institutionalised it. And then you have from the 60s, 70s a pushback against that. Agus sin so Colin an you once said the classroom isn't accessible or it's out there, so I'll just say what I was going to say in the classroom and wrap up. That's for 40 minutes, isn't it? So Dave, nihide ólik de mar Louis May on 3 so he's Hus and Stowl most mal in terms of the ideology of Gaeilge school and decolonial ideology in Ireland. There's sort of 3 legs to the stool, as I mentioned: self-respect, self-reliance, and self-belief. And it's interesting when I conducted interviews with a lot of the Gaeilge school founders and teachers and pupils. Even though they wouldn't, a lot of them drew very heavily on Pearse, obviously, in terms of where the language should be, in terms of the centrality to the nation. But if when I read back the sort of transcriptions of the interviews I've done with them, you see all these references in the transcriptions to, respect and Buggus few, or nor guilt and shame. So it was all about banishing those sort of ideas that were prevalent among Irish people even in the 60s and 70s, and as we know are still prevalent among a cohort of Irish people. I usually say it's around 16 or 15% that are vocally anti-Gaelic, and then larger pool, well, in the 26 counties of course, and then larger pool of 70% or 60% are favourable, and then there's a few don't knows there, I suppose, as well. Fecinn tú an nasc leis an Gaeilge na Gaeilge Scoil Éanna nasc díreach leis an Pearseach I dtéirmí an smíontóireachta de. In terms of cultural nationalism, there's a direct continuity there with Pearse's thought and with the Gaeilge school movement that was founded in the early 70s. And I suppose one of the things the historians or the revisionist historians try to do as well in terms of this notion of continuity, they try to break it, because to them things operate at this sort of high politics level where there's changes of governments in the 19th and 20th century, and they don't look at history from below. It has a sort of consistent nationalism and republicanism throughout it, but also a consistent pro-Irish language element, so that's one of the things. And then finally I saw Larkin when we came in here as well. He wasn't a big fan of the school, and there were sort of clashes in terms of the big thing about Gaeilge Scoil Éanna and the Irish language movement is class, and it's a sort of ceist cigiltach now, a sticky question, because Larkin would have had opposition with Cullenswood at the time, because there was a few landlords in Cullenswood who would have been slumlords and so forth. So it was a cross-class movement. It still is to some degree, although in the 6 counties it's more working class and so forth. But I suppose as a minority language movement, I suppose it's not that it needs must, but it's just that people are more willing to take in people who wouldn't be strictly on the left and so forth. But how then to reach out to the working class, and how then to make links with socialists and trade unionists and progressive Republicans.